time for another story, and this one is about the people that used to live next door to my naughty little sister. Can you remember what their names were? Mr. and Mrs. Jones, except my naughty little sister used to call them Mr. and Mrs. Coco Jones. And this story is called My Naughty Little Sister and Poor Charlie Coco. So I wonder who Charlie Coco is. In the days when I was a little girl and my naughty little sister was a very small child, my little sister often helped Mrs. Coco Jones to do her housework. Mrs. Coco worked so hard and she had such a clean and tidy house that she was glad when my little sister came to help her. Mrs. Coco Jones had a shiny red dustpan and a brush with a red handle, and because my little sister was such a helpful child, Mrs. Coco brought her a nice shiny red dustpan and a little red brush with a red handle for herself. Wasn't that kind of her? Mrs. Coco hung her dustpan and brush on a hook behind her broom cupboard door when she wasn't using them, and dear Mr. Coco put up another hook behind the broom cupboard door so that my little sister could hang her dustpan and her brush there too. It was a nice low hook so that my little sister could reach it all by herself. What a smiley, pleased girl she was when she saw her own little dustpan and brush hanging beneath Mrs. Coco's big dustpan and brush. "Now we shall work and work, Mrs. Coco," my little sister said. When Mrs. Coco swept the carpets, she knelt on the floor and brushed the dust into her dustpan, and my little sister knelt on the floor too and brushed the dust into her dustpan. Sweep, sweep went Mrs. Coco's big brush, and sweep, sweep went my little sister's small brush. "Aren't we busy, Mrs. Coco?" said my little sister as she brushed and brushed. Mrs. Coco would sit up and say, "Oh, my poor back." And my naughty little sister would sit up and say, "Oh, my poor back." And then they would carry their pans of dust out to the dustbin and grumble about hard work. My little sister was only pretending to grumble because she liked helping Mrs. Coco and her back wasn't really bad at all. But poor Mrs. Coco really was grumbling when she said, "Oh, my poor back." Now, kind Mr. Coco was very worried about Mrs. Coco's poor back. So one day he took some money out of his savings and bought Mrs. Coco a fine vacuum cleaner. Mrs. Coco was pleased. She had never had a vacuum cleaner before, and when Mr. Coco fixed it up for her and showed her how very quickly it worked, she was excited. Mrs. Coco was so excited that she hurried into her back garden and called to my little sister who was playing in our garden. "Come and see what Mr. Jones has brought for me," she called, and my little sister ran and fetched her dolly, Rosie Primrose, to see too. Then my little sister hurried through her own little gate into Mrs. Coco's garden, and then through the back door into Mrs. Coco's shiny clean kitchen. Then my little sister stopped. She stood still and listened. There was a funny humming noise coming from Mrs. Coco's sitting room, and my little sister didn't like it. "Come in," said Mrs. Coco. "Come and see my new cleaner." Then my little sister walked forward and looked in at the sitting room door. She had never seen a vacuum cleaner before, so she stared and stared and listened and listened. And she didn't like it one little bit. "I don't like it," said my naughty little sister. "I want to go home." Then Mr. Coco switched off the cleaner and the noise stopped, but my little sister still didn't like it. "I want to go home," she said. "But it's to help poor Mrs. Coco do her work," said Mr. Coco in his kind voice. "It will eat all the nasty dust for her." "I help Mrs. Coco do the work," said my sister. "I help Mrs. Coco do the work." And she began to cry and cry. And she ran right out of Mrs. Coco's tidy clean house and back to our house crying and crying. And she wouldn't go to see Mrs. Coco at all. My little sister wouldn't go into Mrs. Coco's house for a long while. And as she heard the cleaner working when she was playing in our garden, she ran straight into our mother and hid her face in our mother's apron because she didn't like the noise that the cleaner made. Now, Mrs. Coco Jones was very, very sad when my little sister wouldn't come and see her because she loved my bad little sister very much. The vacuum cleaner did a lot of work for Mrs. Coco, and her bad back was a good deal better. But Mrs. Coco was still sad. So she spoke to Mr. Coco, and he said he would have a word with my little sister and see if he could make her like the vacuum cleaner after all. One morning, when Mr. Coco was digging his garden and my little sister was blowing some of the lovely white fluffy seeds from a dandelion flower, Mr. Coco said, "I think our Charlie would like some of that fluff." My little sister was surprised to hear Mr. Coco say this, because she didn't know anything about Charlie. "Poor Charlie gets so hungry," said Mr. Coco Jones, "and all we can give him to eat is dust and dirt. And he does love some nice fluff if he can get it." "What Charlie?" said my little sister. "What Charlie is hungry?" "Charlie the cleaner," said clever Mr. Coco. "Charlie who eats the dirt for Mrs. Coco. There's not a lot of dirt in our house, you know," he said. "Poor old Charlie." Mr. Coco spoke so nicely that Charlie sounded just like a poor hungry boy, and my little sister felt quite sorry about him. She gave Mr. Coco the dandelion flower seeds and said, "For Charlie," and Mr. Coco took them indoors. Then my little sister heard the sound of Mrs. Coco's cleaner. But this time she didn't run indoors. She stood and listened to the sound poor Charlie made when he ate the dandelion fluff. And she was quite glad to think that she had given it to him. When Mr. Coco came out again, my little sister said, "Did Charlie like it?" And Mr. Coco said, "Yes, it was a great treat for him." So then my little sister went up and down the garden and picked a lot of dandelion clocks for Charlie. "Why don't you come in and give them to him?" said Mr. Coco. "Come and see him eat them all up." "Poor old Charlie," Mr. Coco said. "Poor old Charlie," said my little sister, and because she was quite sorry for poor Charlie, she went into Mrs. Coco's house to see him. When my little sister really looked at poor Charlie, she wasn't a bit frightened. When she saw that he had a round, shiny body and a long trunk thing. There was a shiny handle fixed to Charlie's trunk, and that had a black mouth-looking thing at the end of it. "Hello, Charlie Coco," said my little sister. "You are a funny-looking boy." When Mr. Coco switched on Charlie's noise, my little sister didn't like it at all, but she wasn't frightened anymore. She laughed and put her hands over her ears and watched as Charlie ate up all the dandelion seeds. He was hungry. My little sister knew that there wouldn't be very much for him on Mrs. Coco's clean floors. She knew that you had to do a great deal of brushing to get even a little dust from those carpets. My little sister was so sorry for Charlie that you can never guess what she did. She went to Mr. Coco's broom cupboard and got out her own little dustpan and brush. Then she went out into Mrs. Coco's garden and swept up a nice pan of dust from the path and brought it in and gave it to him. "There, Charlie, eat it up, do," my little sister said. "Poor Charlie Coco." And look, there's a picture of Mrs. Coco and Charlie Coco, the vacuum cleaner, and my little sister putting her hands up over her ears because she didn't like the noise. But she wasn't frightened at the end, sure she wasn't. So my naughty little sister liked to help Mrs. Coco to do the sweeping and the cleaning. I wonder how many of you like to help Mum and Dad help in the house. Do you help with the hoovering or the vacuuming? Do you help clean the table? Do you put your toys away? It would be really great to think that you were all helping too, because we all live in our houses and our homes, and it's great and really important that we all try to keep them safe and tidy for each other, and it's a great way to show that we love each other. So see what you can do to help today, and I'll see you for the next story.